us today. As Sam mentioned, this event will be recorded and will be made available on the Center for Medical Humanities website in the near future. My name is Tan Nguyen. I'm one of the center's executive committee member. I'll be introducing our speaker today. I'm delighted to welcome everyone here for our work in progress presentation. I want to thank the center staff for their excellent work in making today's and all of our events possible. Thank you, Sam Carter, Joanne Jamora, and Amanda Swain. You know, the work in progress series provides our faculty and students from around the campus the opportunity to showcase their research projects that engage with the intersection of medicine, arts, and humanities. Before I turn over to Dr. Mark Fisher, I want to announce our next event, which will be on May 13 at 6 o'clock with Ashley Hope, an event on narrative medicine. So today we'll be talking about cognition and political ideology, a study of neuropolitics. We have three speakers led by Dr. Fisher, Davin Phoenix, and Sierra Powell. Dr. Fisher is a professor of neurology at UC Irvine, where he holds appointments in the departments of anatomy and neurobiology, political science, and pathology and laboratory medicine, along with the Beckman Laser Institute, and is a member of UCI Mind. His edited work, Medical Therapy for Acute Stroke, was published in 1989, years before the first successful acute stroke therapy clinical trials. His NIH stroke research grant has been funded for nearly 40 years, and he has received approximately 50 citations of clinical excellence as a stroke neurologist by a variety of external organizations. He's currently engaged in clinical and basic vascular neurobiology research, along with interdisciplinary investigations, and provides stroke care in the inpatient, emergency room, and clinic settings. Our second speaker is Davin Phoenix. He's an associate professor of political science at UC Irvine. He researches how race influences the emergence and effects of anger, pride, and hope in politics. How protests and media narratives on policing influence state policies, and how religious views shape the political behavior of people. Davin is a recipient of the 2017-2018 Dean's Honorary for Teaching Excellence Award and a 2019 UROP Chancellor Award for Excellence in Fostering Undergrad Research. Our third speaker is Sierra Powell, who is the chair of the Department of Geography and Political Science and professor of political science at Mount San Antonio College. Her research focuses on American political behavior, the politics of disability, and the politics of health. Her work has appeared in American Politics Research, Presidential Studies Quarterly, the Journal of Health Politics, Policy and Law, Policy Studies, and other edited volumes. So the center is very pleased to have our speakers with us, and I'll hand over to our speakers to begin.
Okay, thank you, Tan.
Sam, can you?
Thanks, Tan. My name is Mark Fisher, and I'm a professor of neurology, and I have a joint appointment in the Department of Political Science. And the topic of our presentation today is titled Cognition and Political Ideology, a study of neuropolitics. It's certainly fitting that we present this work to the Medical Humanities Center Work in Progress because it was 4 years ago that we applied for and were funded by the Medical Humanities Institute for a research grant proposal to do this very project that we're presenting to you today. So we're very happy to be able to share our work with you. And I particularly want to acknowledge the support of Professor Doug Haynes, who is director of the Medical Humanities Institute at that time. And then next slide. This is an edition of an important political science journal called Perspectives on Politics. It came out in 2004. And the front cover is, as you can see, not what you would normally expect to see on the front cover of a political science journal. And it was one of my introductions to the topic of neuropolitics. And being a neurologist who was involved in the political science department at UCI at that time, I was particularly intrigued by this topic. And as it turned out, the idea of neuropolitics, which is subject matter at the intersection of political science, neurology, neuroscience, it's a little amorphous, a little unclear what the dimensions of this area of inquiry were. And what I'd like to share with you on the next slide is some of my ideas as to what constitutes neuropolitics, and then I'll go into each of these 5 areas. So one is neuropolitics as an extension of political psychology, neuropolitics as the use of neuroscience tools to study politics, the use of neuroscience concepts to develop political theory, neuropolitics as the assessment of neurological disorders of political figures, and neuropolitics as a way to analyze the impact of neurological disorders on political behavior. Next slide. And in talking about political psychology, you go back to the work of Harold LASSWELL, who was one of the giants of political science in the 20th century. And he had many novel ideas. And one of his more provocative ideas was the notion of what he called the political psychiatrist, someone who provides insight into forces that may lead away from responsible behavior and into destructive actions. And the comment about the political psychiatrist is here, it does not make sense to stand by silently while absurdly unrealistic alternatives are discussed by people who themselves have psychological needs that override their judgment. And in fact, the medical establishment took up the call and has shown to do a fair amount of political engagement over the decades. And certainly among all the medical specialties, it's been the psychiatrists who have been really in the forefront of political engagement within the medical community. But that engagement has been not without controversy. And I'll tell you some of that controversy a little bit later in my part of the talk. Next slide. Another area of neuropolitics is using neuroscience tools to study politics. And if you look at the literature of neuropolitics, it largely consists of studies using functional magnetic resonance imaging to try to identify what parts of the brain are active in political decision-making. And this is one example, kind of an interesting study dating back to 2004, in which Democrats were shown pictures of the opposing candidate, George Bush, and Republicans were shown pictures of the opposing candidate, John Kerry, and looking for what parts of the brain were preferentially activated. In fact, there were several brain regions that showed differential activation when politically engaged individuals were confronted with images of the opposing candidate. This is typical of the kind of study that you see in the literature that addresses neuropolitics. Next slide. Another area of neuropolitics is the use of neuroscience concepts to develop political theory. And a good example of this derives from the work of Antonio Damasio, who's a neurologist and neuroscientist. And he and others have emphasized the relationship between emotion and decision-making. And Damasio has come up with a whole series of books directed to the lay public. They've been very well received, the most famous of which was Descartes' Error, came out in 1994, which looked at rational decision-making not as something cool and distant from emotions, but rather decision-making that was in fact dependent on an emotional basis. in order to proceed effectively and efficiently. He got into issues such as gut feelings and how these subliminal feelings helped drive decision-making, rational decision-making. There's an important linkage then between decision-making and emotion. Next slide. And it turned out that one of the consequences of that kind of thinking was the development of an important political theory called affective intelligence, which is a very interesting way of looking at politics and political behavior. And if you really start to consider it, it helps to explain a fair amount of what we see in the political landscape. On the left, you see what we normally experience in terms of the political landscape, where we see events, political activities, political events that are relatively familiar. And in this context of the theory of affective intelligence tends to generate enthusiasm and what they call habituated choice. That is, our political attitudes sort of function on autopilot. It's a automatic, reactive kind of response, in contrast to what you see on the right side of this figure, in which individuals are confronted with something different, something unfamiliar, and particularly something anxiety-provoking. And that's the emotion of anxiety that is thought to impact the individuals so that they may reconsider their political attitudes and make some changes, perhaps, in their political behavior. So that anxiety, sometimes referred to as hot button issues that we encounter all the time, can be very effective in terms of changing political attitudes. And there certainly are candidates, as we know, candidates and political movements that are very effective in raising anxiety and pushing those hot button issues, and they can be effective. Next slide. Now, another aspect of neuropolitics is the assessment of neurological issues in political figures. And I show on this slide the blood pressure readings of a 20th century American president. And as you can see, at age 53, starting off with normal blood pressure, and over a 10-year period of time, reaching levels that are alarmingly high. And it would come as no surprise that this resulted in a catastrophic neurological event leading to the death of this president. That president, of course, was Franklin Roosevelt. And in the next slide, just a reminder that Roosevelt was not the only president to sustain a stroke while in office. Woodrow Wilson sustained a major right hemisphere stroke during the latter parts of his second term, leaving him quite incapacitated. Eisenhower also experienced a stroke, fortunately, that was relatively minor, and he recovered quite nicely. Next slide. And more contemporary issues was any number of items could be discussed. I mentioned this one, which I find particularly odd and curious. This article came out in August of 2016. This is a now largely forgotten event that occurred on the campaign trail. And as you can see, the headline, "No, Hillary Clinton is not having a seizure in that video," says AP reporter who was there. Well, the video was widely circulated. It's still widely available on the internet. You can track it down and see it for yourself. But basically what happened was that Hillary Clinton was, again, on the campaign trail, walked into a muffin shop, bought a cup of iced tea, and she's walking out of the shop and chatting amiably with well-wishers and press, when suddenly something happens. She starts to bob and bow, and for a period of no more than 5 seconds, an episode occurred. She never loses consciousness. She's awake for the entire event. It ends. She jokes about it. And walks out of the shop. Well, it was captured on video from several angles, and it was a real event. It wasn't something that was fabricated by someone using devious means. It did occur, and this was taken up by Clinton's political opponents, raising questions about whether she was fit to be president. It circulated for a while, and then it was superseded by a number of other events that transpired. But one of the curious things about this event was that the medical establishment and the neurological establishment was completely silent. There was no comment from any physicians, any neurologists as to what actually happened, whether it was something that we should be concerned about, was it a trivial event? As far as we could tell, it was a one-time event. I looked at the video, discussed it with colleagues. No one thinks it was a seizure, but it was some kind of event that apparently was self-limited. It was a neurological episode. The question is, why was there no response from the medical establishment? Why did nobody comment on that? And the next slide starts to give you some indication of why there was hesitation from the American medical establishment in terms of that particular event and a number of other kinds of events that might have transpired on the campaign trail. This takes us back to the presidential campaign of 1964, when Barry Goldwater was running against Lyndon Johnson. And late in the campaign, this magazine came out. The title of the magazine was called Fact. And what they did was they sent out to a large number of psychiatrists a survey about what the psychiatrists thought the mental state was of Barry Goldwater. And it turned out that nearly 1,200 psychiatrists wrote back that they thought that Goldwater was psychologically unfit to be president. Well, as you can imagine, this caused an uproar. And not only an uproar, it resulted in a lawsuit. And 5 years later, Barry Goldwater won a lawsuit directed against this magazine, including its director, who was a rather notorious figure of the day, a man by the name of Ralph Ginsburg. And he won a judgment of $75,000, which was no small sum in those days. And next slide, we see one of the aftermath of this article and the lawsuit was this statement of ethics that came out from the American Psychiatric Association, which states that psychiatrists may be asked for an opinion about an individual who is in the light of public attention. In such circumstances, a psychiatrist may share with the public his or her expertise about psychiatric issues in general. However, it is unethical for a psychiatrist to offer a professional opinion unless he or she has conducted an examination and has been granted proper authorization for such a statement. This has been known as the Goldwater Rule. And in the next slide, you see a much later response from the American Medical Association, basically saying the same thing, but applying not just to psychiatrists, but to physicians in general. So as you can see, the Goldwater Rule is very much in conflict with Harold Laswell's notion of the political psychiatrist, the politically engaged psychiatrist, the politically engaged physician who's offering important insight as a kind of public intellectual. The Goldwater Rule basically says, no, you shouldn't be making serious comments about political figures. And in the next slide, you see one example of individuals who completely disregarded the Goldwater Rule, a book about Donald Trump. And as you know, during the Trump presidency, there were many articles and books published about Donald Trump and about whether he was whether he was fit to be president. This issue of the Goldwater rule and the kinds of comments that should be offered about political figures, about their neurology, neurological issues, this is unsettled area, and it's a subject matter of continuing discussion, a lively area of interest. Next slide. The final area that I wanted to talk about was neuropolitics as a way of looking at the effect of neurological disorders on political behavior. And this was a paper that we wrote a few years ago. I actually wrote it with Gerald Post, who sadly passed away just a few months ago. He was the lead author of the book on Donald Trump that I just showed you. And what we looked at was how executive function changes with age. And in the next slide, just to summarize some of the brain changes that occur over time, and certainly over the age of 60, 65. There's a well-known decline in the decision-making capacities of the public at large. This is executive function, executive dysfunction, and there are brain regions that are well known to show a particular susceptibility to age-related changes, and those tend to subserve executive function decision-making capability. So the idea is that decision-making can be impacted among individuals, including political leaders, in ways that may be quite subtle, so that language and memory may be relatively intact, but decision-making may be impaired. And in the next slide, we have the conclusion of this paper is that we should probably assume that a degree of executive dysfunction is present, at least in some political leaders age 65 and older. And so the next slide, then, this is a lead into the paper that Sierra and Davin are going to be describing in depth. This is the paper that came out late last year, Cognition and Political Ideology and Aging. In addition to the three of us, Sean Rosenberg from the Political Science Department, Dana Grina, Maria Carrata, Claudia Kawas, and Anlia Paganini-Hill from the 90+ study were all heavily involved. And what we looked at in the next slide was the impact of cognitive decline on political behavior. And this received a fair amount of attention in the media late last year. This was an article that came out in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And in the next slide was an article that came out in the New York Times. Provocative title, "Having Dementia Doesn't Mean You Can't Vote." Yes, you can help a cognitively impaired person participate in the election. Interesting article in the New York Times that really gets to this issue of what happens to political behavior and voting behavior with the decline in cognition. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Sierra Powell.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much again for having us today. I'd like to start with sharing a little bit of background about disability and politics and kind of why we took on this study and why this matters. So to think about this first, political science has observed a voting gap between those with and without disabilities. And in general, what we find is that people with disabilities vote at lower rates than those that do not have disabilities, maybe up to even 12%. So at some level, this is concerning for American democracy as a whole. And part of what my cause, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, has been thinking about what are some things that we could do to help this population really get out to the polls and participate in politics? Next slide, please. So here's some data showing you turnout by disability. Obviously, there are many different kinds of conditions, and this breaks it down into kind of a standard 6 subset group. You can see that relevant to the 90+ study, people that have difficulty concentrating and remembering, also people that have difficulty doing errands alone or maybe dressing or bathing themselves are voting at lower rates. Note also here that the 2020 data is actually from 2019. People said that they we're going to vote. And it's really difficult to, in political science, get some of these disability type questions, these disability type questions on a survey. But we're doing the best that we can. And nevertheless, there are differences among disability types. Next slide, please. There are also a variety of different laws that apply to voting and also disability. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and the disability rights advocacy groups generally consider the Black civil rights movement to be a catalyst for the disability rights movement. And the original VRA does prohibit denying the right to vote based on failure to comply with any test or device, and also prohibits conditioning the right of vote of such persons on the ability to read, write, understand, or interpret any matter in the English language. So that's, again, relevant for people who are aging and may have those functions decreasing over time. And then in 1984, the VRA was amended to say that any voter who requires assistance can choose the person that they want to assist them. So it doesn't have to be your employer, it doesn't have to be, a member of your union. And then later on in 1984, we observed the Voting Accessibility for Elderly and Handicapped Act. And this basically said that, polling places, so physical polling places, had to have new accessibility standards, and alternative means of casting a ballot must be made available. So particularly for people that might be blind or deaf that need certain types of ballots, those things are supposed to be provided. Next slide, please. And then the big Disability Rights Act we see in 1990 is the Americans with Disabilities Act. What was really great about this act is that it was a broad political coalition. The thing about aging and disability is that anyone can get old and anyone can get disabled at any time. So it's not always something that occurs maybe at birth. And the ADA requires public entities to safeguard the equal opportunity of voting. And the way that we define disability has been really messy in the political science literature and in the social science literature in general, but all the different acts have their own way that they define disability. Then in 1993, we observed the National Voter Registration Act. Some of you are probably familiar with this as the Motor Voter Act. But again, if people are having difficulty doing errands or difficulty going outside, it's more convenient for them to, if they're already at the DMV for some reason, to also be able to register to vote there. And then in 2002, we have the Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act. And this provided an update requirement to update voting technology, to have at least one direct recording electronic voting system to help people with disabilities at the polling place. Next slide, please. So we've made a lot of advances. People with disabilities have gained a lot of laws and gained a lot of rights as we've gone through time, but there are a whole host of areas of concern. One concern is that, if there are people that are getting assistance with their ballot, some are concerned about ballot secrecy and ballot integrity. How can we really ensure that for those people? Also, as technology advances and maybe you have people that use certain types of computing devices, or maybe no one is doing this now, but if we were to ever vote online, there are concerns about, verification and secrecy, for that purpose. And also there's a whole host of lawsuits and disability law related to how we define accessibility and how we define reasonable accommodation in a variety of different circumstances. A big issue has been that laws are passed at the federal level. So for example, the Help America Vote Act says, dear states, you need to update your voting technology, but then doesn't provide funding for states to do that. And so states are kind of left on their own to figure out their funding and to actually make those changes. And as a result, the application of federal law by state is very different. And also, The federal government can regulate federal elections, but as you know, we have a whole host of other elections, maybe state, county, city, other levels of government, which may not be governed by federal laws. So there are gaps in protections for people with disabilities than federal elections versus in other types of non-federal elections. States have a variety of different laws that vary on who can vote and the terms of their election laws, and also guardianship terms. So thinking through some of those differences. Next slide, please. So what are some things that we could do moving forward? Some things that might help this population. Some of you that teach might have heard of the concept of universal design in the classroom, but the idea of universal designed ballots is the idea that any ballot would be accessible to everyone at all times. So thinking about different ways to design the ballot itself to begin with. Another opportunity is to increase voter education. So there may be a whole host of people with either cognitive decline or other types of disabilities out there that don't really know the types of accommodations that are available to them and don't know the type of help that they can get. So educating voters themselves is something that we can do better on. And also poll worker education. So when people show up at the polls and they do have a disability, are the people working at the polls equipped to manage this population? Do they have the resources that they need? Do they know how to point these people in the right direction? Also, studies have shown that convenience voting helps people with disabilities and lots of other groups as well. So this includes things like early in-person voting. If you take a really long time, but you want to vote in person, maybe going early when the crowds aren't there would be something that would be helpful. Also, mail voting is considered a convenience voting measure. This past election was really unique because of the pandemic. So I wanted to share with you just kind of what happened in 2020. So 34 states and Washington, D.C. said that there was no excuse required. So if you wanted to have, a mail ballot, all you had to do was request it. That is the most friendly measure that you can do. 10 states and DC also did an all mail election. So just didn't have any polling places at all. And then 16 states require an excuse. So that is to say, if you have a disability and you want to vote by mail, you had to go through a process of requesting it and checking a box and providing an explicit excuse. And disability is accepted as one of those excuses, but saying why. So as you can see at the state level, there are kind of more friendly and maybe less friendly laws to help this population to vote. And I think with that, I will turn it on to Devin.
Good evening, everyone. I echo my fellow presenters in thanking the center for giving us the space to share our work. So I'll be describing the study we conducted and the results and implications. As I think we've been indicating or intimating, these questions not only about access, but how cognition is potentially shaping the ways in which people make political decisions have become steadily more relevant for us because our electorate is steadily graying. We know two things that will be very apparent. Older people are most likely to vote, and older people are becoming steadily older and a part of our electorate. So we want to kind of have a better understanding, right, of how these kinds of cognitive factors and the potential impacts on people's ideology, their decision-making, can have real implications for election outcomes, both in local and national contexts. So we conducted a study. The study was conducted on people that are part of the 90+ study. So this is folks that are 90 years old and older that live in California retirement community and local surrounding areas. They are subject to semi-annual neurologic exams and cognitive testing. And so we were able to offer this brief question instrument to people who we had the results of their most recent neurological exam. So this was a two-wave study. We sent them the questionnaire between April and December 2017, and then 6 months after they completed that first questionnaire, they received that same questionnaire again. So we were able to see if their responses changed at all or remained stable across this time period. we see from this pie chart that 55% of our sample of folks that completed the survey have normal functioning, normal cognitive functioning. 33% have cognitive impairment but are not demented, and then 12% have dementia. And so next slide, please. We'll get into some of the details later. So you see here the response rates for the first and the second wave. We had a very strong response rate. 79% of the people that received the first survey completed it and returned it to us by mail. In the time between the first and second wave, 9 of the original participants passed away. So we see this revised sample size of 142. And the list, it's not listed there, but about 81% of people also sent in that second survey. So we are left with 115 people that we can look at both the first and second wave. Next slide, please. So we note some demographic characteristics of the sample. You see it's not the most diverse across various metrics. So 62% identify as women, so about 3 in 5 are women. 96%, so virtually all of the participants are white, and disproportionately large percentage of folks have college degrees. So we don't have much generalizability we can draw from, but we can still find some interesting kind of takeaways. Next slide, please. So we were looking to assess how people's self-identified placement on the liberal conservative scale was consistent with or departed from the liberal or conservative leanings of their policy preferences in these 6 dimensions. So in the questionnaire, we just asked them to place themselves from extremely liberal to extremely conservative. And we see from this pie chart, there's a plurality of people that identify as liberal with that blue segment there, but we still have some pretty decent variation, right? With a non-trivial percentage of people identifying as conservative. And we have that 19%, right? Good 1/5 of the population of the sample identify themselves as kind of moderate, right in the middle there. So decent variation, if not equitable across both sides. And we asked them to rate their preferences on these 6 dimensions here. So would they like to see federal spending increased or decreased or stay about the same on schooling, on aid to the poor, and on protecting the environment? And we also asked that 4th item there, would they like to see rates of immigration into the US decline, stay about the same, or increase? And then lastly, we asked them the degree to which they favor or oppose the following policy issue domains: minority preferences in university admissions, oppose, favor that, or neutral, and the death penalty, right, for capital crimes, oppose, favor, or neutral. So again, what we're looking to see is if there is a relationship between this sample's cognitive functioning and the consistency between their ideological placement and their policy preferences. Next slide, please. So before we get into the relationship across cognitive functioning, let's look at some basic kind of distributions of where the sample was at. We see, consistent with that pie chart, that the sample, and for these respective bar graphs, don't read the kind of not stated as part of the flow, right? Those are people that didn't place themselves. So you skew that bar, you see that this is skewed somewhat towards liberal folks, right? Good variation, but skewed towards liberal folks. Next slide, please. So when we get into the policy preferences, we see that the skew overall does appear to be consistent with people's self-placement. What we see here are the distribution of responses to those 3 spending questions: federal spending on public schooling, federal spending on aid to the poor, and federal spending on environmental protection. So again, kind of not looking at that not stated set of bars as part, right, of the distribution, we see that indeed people are expressing preferences that are more liberal, right, looking to increase federal spending in each of these areas. So again, we see overall ideological alignment between self-placement and policy preference. Next slide, please. We see a similar consistency here when we look at preferences for immigration rates. Now, while the plurality want to see those stay intact, those rates of immigration, we still see just slightly more people looking to preferring to increase it rather than to decrease it. Again, it's very close. This is more of a normal distribution, but largely not at the least inconsistent with people's self-placement. Next slide, please. Now here we're looking at the two areas in which they can favor or oppose the issue, and that is represented by the light bars: minority preference in university admissions, so some form of affirmative action, and the death penalty for conviction of murder. Now, this is where we actually see a bit of a disalignment between people's placement and their policy preferences. If, again, we ignore kind of the not stated and just look at the distribution, we see that people are slightly more likely to oppose minority preferences in admissions, slightly more likely to favor the death penalty. So we see here that the preferences seem to be skewed in the more conservative direction, right, despite people's more liberal self-placement. Next slide, please. So now that we looked at those distributions, we can get a firmer sense of how the consistency between your ideological self-placement and your policy preferences aligns with your rate or level of cognitive functioning. So the first column here, we see simply the correlations between ideological self-placement and preference correlation. So the higher the correlation, the more consistent was your set of policy preferences with your placement, which means if you identified yourself as more conservative, you express more conservative policy preferences and vice versa. Now, when we look at these next two columns, the cognitively normal and the cognitively impaired, we're comparing the differences, right? And we see across the board, people that are cognitively impaired, including those that are and are not demented, have a lower correlation between self-placement and policy preferences. Now, when we look at the last column here, we can see through t-tests for the difference in means, which of those differences correlations reach statistical significance at the 0.05 alpha level. And so apologies if the kind of left column is slightly skewed from the rest of the columns here, but what from the rows, I should say, what is notable is that when the difference in the correlation between the cognitively impaired and the cognitively normal reaches significance is in the domains that are most relevant to social identities. So federal spending on aid to the poor, strongly significant. Rates of immigration, strongly significant. Minority preferences and admissions, strongly, very strongly significant. And then preferences on the death penalty, marginally significant. So I think this is an interesting takeaway, because when we see that disconnect be greatest between where you place yourself and what your preferences are, is in the domains in which you likely have a specific racial group, if not some socially relevant identity group in mind. And so what are the potential implications or takeaways there? That was in the SEVER survey, right? So again, we did this entire same process with the surviving sample 6 months later. So the next slide, if you can go to that, shows us the results for the second wave. And so once again, if you kind of look at those middle two columns, you see that across the board, the cognitively impaired across all these policy domains exhibit a weaker relationship between where they place themselves and their policy preferences. Well, now we look at the last column, where those are significant is a little slightly different. So once again, federal spending on aid to the poor remains significant. And once again, using the death penalty remains significant. In fact, in the second wave, they go from marginally significant to strongly significant. But interestingly here, we also see that environmental protection, federal spending on environmental protection is marginally significant. We also see that overall, in total, there is a marginally significant difference in the correlation, right, between placement and preference between the normal and the cognitively impaired. Next slide. Thank you. So this chart allows us to see across both waves what the correlations look like along the cognitively normal and the cognitively impaired. So when you compare the yellow and red markers, you see how those correlations shifted amongst the cognitively normal from the first to the second wave. So it's interesting that in some domains like protecting the environment there, correlation, none of these are kind of statistically all that strong. What we see here with the lines are the kind of 95% confidence intervals, excuse me. You do see a slight uptick in the kind of consistency between preference and placement on something like environmental protection from the first wave to the second wave. In contrast, again, just looking at those yellow and red markers, you see something like preference for minorities in college admissions in that second wave. The correlation becomes a little weaker. And in many of these instances, it's pretty similar across, right? No essential change whatsoever. Now, looking to the blue and green bars, this represents the correlation between the cognitively impaired respondents in that first wave, represented by blue, and that green wave, in the second wave, represented by the green. And so we see a couple of notable upticks in correlation when you look at the rates of immigration, fourth kind of set of bars, and that fifth set of bars, preference for minority treatment, preference for minority admissions in college. It seems like in that second wave, for whatever reason, the correlation actually became stronger. And then you see an opposite effect for preference of the death penalty, where that correlation becomes much weaker 6 months later between placement on that left-right scale and the placement of their preference. So yeah, let's go to the next slide. Importantly, we also asked whether they voted in the 2016 election, and we see no significant or substantive difference, really, just a 5% difference. I guess when the level of, when the numbers are that large, the difference between 94 and 89% can be actually substantially important, but both the cognitively fully functioning and the cognitively impaired are voting at particularly high rates, right? If we were to compare this with turnout rates across the board, these would easily be 20 to 30 points higher. So why is this relevant? Because this group is more likely than any other group to vote despite level of cognitive functioning, right? So we're talking about people making decisions that they are actually translating into action to a far greater extent than other age cohorts. Next slide, please. So here we can think about the kind of summarizing trends and those implications. So generally, for both the cognitively impaired and the cognitively normally functioning, what they've stated as their ideology remained pretty consistent. And generally, we saw some fissures there, but what they stated as their preferences were consistent from one survey to another. Why is that significant, right? Because it is not always the case that we expect people, regardless of their age cohort, to express consistent policy preferences from one time point to another. Kind of the initial wave of studies in public behavior indicated that people's preferences were so unstable and so unconstrained that if you ask them the same policy preference at a different time than when you first asked them, they might have a completely different answer for you because they're kind of drawing on simply what's on the top of their head at the moment. So the fact that we see some consistency, I think, does indicate that we have entered a phase in which the level of polarization within politics makes people's ability to maintain some stability in their preferences, because they have such clear directives from the parties with which they are aligned, how they should view these different policy issues and preference points, that we see some consistency that we haven't always seen in past eras. But we did indeed see that the linkage between self-placement and the ideological scale and policy preferences were indeed kind of weaker for the cognitively impaired, and that weakness was most notable, again, in those areas that are making social identities relevant: aid to the poor, immigration, admissions preference for racial minorities, and the death penalty. So what we see here is that, particularly for the impaired, we might see more of a tendency of ideology to act not as this constraining framework to guide people in their policy preferences, but more so as a relevant social identity in and of itself. Next slide, please. Before thinking through some of the broader implications of this, we want to reiterate the limitations. We recognize that the cohort under study was overwhelmingly white, mostly college educated, and from a prosperous community. The follow-up, being limited to 6 months, may or may not be a limitation. 6 months is really plenty of time for the kind of political sea change to kind of take place. But it is a relatively small sample size. Of course, everyone was above the age of 90. Next slide, please. And so this study raises questions about how stable people's ideological self-placement is versus how unstable. Should we be concerned that, particularly for the cognitively impaired, that linkage between placement on the ideological scale and preferences wasn't as strong, particularly given that we saw that linkage be weakest when highly salient social identity groups were the reference point, whether it's immigrants or people of color or people perceived to be poor, which is a very racialized concept and identity label within the US. And of course, given the racialization of crime and punishment, the image people might have conjured in their mind thinking about people convicted of murder was most likely a racialized image. What does that possibly tell us? And how does that map on with the larger ways in which people form attachments to partisanship and ideology? There's been work within political science and political psychology that indicates that in today's era of increased partisan difference and distance, and also polarization, not just in terms of disagreement, but in terms of hostility and antipathy towards the partisan outgroup, that people's partisanship carries a social significance that carries more weight than maybe the kind of, it's no longer a case of I'm Republican or I'm Democrat because I see these as the actions that government needs to take or not take. And because of that, right, I'm aligned with this side. It's more like I'm aligned with this side because they are morally superior. I'm aligned with this side because the other side is wrong. The other side is wrong-headed. The other side is evil. Right? So that level of social attachment to partisanship is labeled affective polarization, where I am just as motivated in seeing the other side lose as I am seeing my policy agenda take hold. So this phenomenon is probably much more broadly shared amongst people regardless of their cognitive function. So we have to consider the degree to which cognitive impairment only accelerates, right, the degree to which we view our partisanship as the us versus them, and less as an indicator of what we view as the best ways for government to act to address issues. And so to kind of relate to Sierra's conversation about the question of accessibility, this becomes all the more relevant given this is a group of people that have had staunch traditions and habits of voting. We know that one of the strongest predictors of whether you're lucky to vote in an election is whether you voted before. We're talking about people that have had longstanding habits of participation. So even despite some of the barriers to the ballot that might come about as they age and enter new challenges, both physical and mental, the desire to vote is likely going to be undeterred, as we saw with the, again, very high rates of turnout reported from our sample. And so how can we think about not just ways to remove some of those barriers to the ballot, but try to ensure that people are making decisions that are truly consistent with what they want. This is relevant not just because of the graying of the electorate, but because we can think about this era that many people have titled the post-truth era, right? As we have affective polarization and more people viewing the partisan or ideological outgroup as the enemy, right? We have people entering into information silos where they receive almost exclusive information that reinforces their pre-existing beliefs, and they are subject to not just information, but misinformation that also informs those beliefs. When we look at partisan differences in everything from whether the 2020 election was fairly determined or the scope of the threat raised by the coronavirus, right, we see just how strong a role misinformation plays. And so we can think about the vulnerability and disparate vulnerabilities of different groups to that misinformation, particularly since that misinformation can be packaged in a way that is kind of promising or enticing to them because it is kind of meted out through the identities that they view as relevant for them. So this next step laid out here talks about our desire to conduct similar study with younger and more diverse samples. But even before we reach that stage, we're able to derive more insightful information from the 90 plus participants. We've just very recently put into the field a revised version of the same questionnaire from the 2017 study in order to gain better leverage on how that maybe tenuous relationship between ideology and policy preference is shaped by identity. We asked about people's relationship to their American identity and how salient it was. And we asked questions that get at their sense of potential racial antipathy towards African Americans as a racial outgroup, and the degree to which they view structural or individualist attributions for racial disparities. So we think that we can gain even more leverage on these kinds of cross currents, right? Evolving understandings of people's ideology, evolving understandings of people's placement, and how they are viewing these relevant outgroups, outgroups that are often defining much of our political discourse. So I'm pretty sure that's the final slide. Thank you so much for your time. We look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating, very informative. Do we have any questions from the audience? My screen's a little glitchy here. Does anybody have a question from our audience? Can you speak on the rise of misinformation in political discourse, political participation? Should we be concerned about misinformation online campaigns and issues of ability or disability?
I don't know if anyone wants to jump in. I can say, in short, we should absolutely be concerned about it, and not just via online communications, which certainly online communications doesn't have any of the traditional gatekeeping. So we don't have the same kind of filters or vigilance about guarding against just straight up blatant misinformation. But I'm sure you all, just like myself, were inundated with physical mailers for a good months-long stretch leading up to the 2020 election. And if you took a close look at those before throwing them immediately to the recycling bin, you might have seen that there's a great deal of misinformation and kind of misleading statements, and also clear efforts to tie people in local races, either favorably or unfavorably, to national figureheads that have, positive or negative reputations. And so I think being able to curry favor based on whether you paint yourself or your opponents as associated, right, with people deemed the good guys or the bad guys, I think really removes substantive consideration of your policy stances from the equation. And so I think that's going to be something that we have to be very vigilant about. But I think that question about how are we more vigilant and holding people seeking office more accountable for the information they provide is probably tied to longstanding challenges in ensuring integrity and accountability in elections. And I'm thinking not about ballot access, but about gerrymandering and the ability of parties to essentially determine the outcome of elections before votes are cast. If we're not really dealing with that core issue, I don't know how we create more accountability structures for the misinformation that's being peddled both online and offline.
Thank you. I think Claudia has her hand up for a question. Claudia?
I have a string of things. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So one, I understood that the 90 plus study was in Laguna Woods. Is that where it was? So yes. I think that's going to select highly what your outcomes are. And so that leads me to what Davin was talking about, cross currents. And so I'm wondering if you're going to consider in the next study, social networks, how much interactivity is going to either reinforce and or create new information sources. And then I wanted to know if you're also going to consider, now I see in James's question about misinformation and political discourse and all that, but I'm just thinking there's selection of media. I mean, we've all heard the scenarios of how Fox has ruined grandparents for good. Just so it's not, I don't call that disinformation. I would just call it a media choice that's its own echo chamber. So I wanted to, when you're moving out though, are you going to move beyond then Laguna Woods? And so then you're going to get that cross. I don't think I have anything else to comment until I do.
Well, we're in the midst of a follow-up study within the Laguna Woods population, but you're absolutely right. As Davin has indicated, we really need to move beyond that particular cohort and look at a younger, more diverse group of individuals. One of the things that we hope to look at in this follow-up study is to kind of break down cognitive decline into its components, and to what extent does memory impairment, language impairment, or decision-making capabilities, executive dysfunction, bear on this relationship between ideological self-placement and policy choice. I think the other point regarding misinformation, you really have to wonder how capable, what the abilities are of cognitively impaired people, cognitively impaired voters, to be able to identify what's likely to be true and what's likely to be misinformation. So that really adds another level of complexity to this particular analysis of our data.
I'll also add that people with disabilities in general, not necessarily people with cognitive decline, they participate in different ways. So it may be more difficult for them to get to physically the polling place, but they might be more active online, right? So thinking about an older population, maybe they are more able to write a check than they are to participate in social media. So there's lots of different ways to participate. And one thing that we could possibly do in the future is ask them more about the types of things that they're doing outside of voting.
And I'll say super quickly, I think on the question of the kind of social ties that come about from living in Laguna Woods, I actually wonder, we don't have, I think, the means to empirically get at the effect of those social ties, but I would imagine that they would allow people to be more resistant potentially to the corrupting effects of misinformation, because it developed social capital, right? And part of the issue of people being in these information silos is that we don't necessarily have the social capital we did in past eras, so that people can form bonds of trust with folks that do have opposing views, so they can humanize the other side and not kind of so be up in arms. So maybe it's the case that some of the tenuous relationships between placement and preference come about because people are able to think more with more nuance, right? And not simply adhere to the kind of doctrine of the side they align with.
There's a few questions in the chat. I'm not sure how to answer the one from the Humanities Center about.
The question is, I'm curious about the impact of visual forms on human psychology and behavior. I'm thinking about the game of chess, all of its forms and how old and popular it has been amongst humans. Do you think something about the grid pattern and mathematical forms might impact perception, psychology?
I mean, I'm not sure about that, but what I do know is that one of the other authors of the paper, Sean Rosenberg, is interested in images, and the idea that we might show different people, images of people, and see if they are more interested or less interested to vote for people based on certain images, right? So there's that type of study out there. I don't know, Davin, do you have anything to add about that?
Well, no, I think you really hit on the head in thinking about Sean Rosenberg would be a great person to take this question to, my colleague and poli sci here at UCI, because even beyond Sierra, what you're talking about with his use of visual stimuli, he also does like cognitive testing to see how effectively people can engage in kind of deep critical thinking, how effectively people can identify complex patterns, which I think is somewhat related to this. right? And how that affects their ability to engage in political reasoning. So I think it's beyond my scope to speak definitively to it, but I think there's a there to your question, that if people are engaged in practices like chess throughout life that allow them to not just engage in like thinking, right, but have to think multiple steps ahead and anticipate and think about multiple kind of possibilities, I'd imagine that would translate somehow, some way, to being able to think about politics with a level of kind of nuance and sophistication that's required to navigate the landmine of constant misinformation.
It's also difficult because we were limited in assessment that could be conducted on paper, right? So there were, a lot of these sort of tests that maybe Sean might be interested in were hard for us. We were interested to maybe try it, but were hard for us to, send out in a paper survey and then have them send back. There's another question in there.
So how do we honor people with disabilities and not malign, particularly people with intellectual disabilities, while making sure that political participation is grounded in reality? Are there any policy issues you might suggest?
I mean, part of it is so I shared a little bit about education, right? So doing what you can to educate the populations that are out there of their options, and letting them know that they can have, someone assist them with voting, and then it can be, someone that cares for them, that they care about, right? That sort of thing. In terms of making sure that it's grounded in reality, I mean, I think that's kind of the nature of democracy. Like anyone can make their political decisions on, I liked Barack Obama's speaking style, or for any reason, not just people with disabilities, but people without disabilities as well, make political decisions for all kinds of things that may not be based on their like government actions or what we would like government to do, as Davin was saying.
Thank you. So if no one has any further question, I'd like to wrap up today by thanking our speakers. It was fascinating, as a physician, when I first heard about the question about why didn't physicians speak up when we see some element in our candidates, and I'm like, yeah, why not? And then you talk about a lawsuit, I'm like, oh, that's why. But it's definitely learned something new today, and thank you very much. Let's see what's going to chat. Yeah, so our program today will be on the center for you to view if you want to watch it again, or refer to your friends who couldn't make it today. Again, thank you to our speaker, and we hope that everyone can join us on May 13 at 6 for Ashley Hope event on narrative medicine. On behalf of the Center for Medical Humanities, Jim Lee, and everyone in the committee, thank you for coming to share with us your project, and thank you to our attendees, and have a good evening.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Everyone.
Bye.